What we're going to do in this lesson is talk about the events that ultimately lead to the formal breakdown of relations between Charles and Parliament, and then which would eventually culminate in the outbreak of the Civil War. Now, our focus is going to be mainly on the long and short parliaments that existed during this quite brief period, i.e. the period itself, but the long parliament lasts for a good 20 years until 1660. We'll get to that in a second. And then we'll talk about some of the other things that takes place as well, like, for example, the attacks on the royal prerogative. All of these are ways in which that we see an eroding of the monarchical power that existed and the emboldening of power and authority by parliament. So this is really the political crisis that leads up to the outbreak of the First Civil War. We'll talk about the purposes of, the achievements of, and the purposes for the achievements of both the short parliament and the long parliament, and we'll talk about some of the other subsidiary issues that takes place as well. Let's begin with the short parliament. The short parliament takes place first. Now, the short parliament is aptly titled that, given it took very little time for it to be dissolved. In fact, it was only 3 weeks that the short parliament existed for. It was called in April, and it ended, and it was dissolved in April, 3 weeks later. And so, essentially, the reason why it was dissolved was because of the opposition essentially forced Charles's hand. Now, what was the reason for Charles calling this parliament? Well, essentially it was in response to a number of financial issues. This is the case for this parliament, and it's also the case for the long parliament as well. Financial issues, as we know, plagued Charles's reign through its entirety. So, in 1639, as a result of opposition to the conflict with the Scots, the First Bishops' War, we see a taxpayers' strike. Now, this is significantly problematic for Charles, because this kind of tax was the most useful for him during the period of his personal rule. It was the most useful for him because it raised the most revenue, essentially. And in addition to this, as a result of Thomas Wentworth, alienating the City of London, they only offered him £5,000 in funding, the City of London merchants. And what had happened as a result of this, what had happened that had led to Wentworth alienating the City of London, was in 1635, Wentworth fined the Corporation of London as a result of issues revolving around a number of obligations that the corporation had towards land in Londonderry. So, essentially, the City of London weren't particularly happy. They're London merchants. They didn't offer much funding to Charles, and there was a taxpayers' strike as a result of the conflict with the Scots. All of this meant that there were significant financial issues being had. The result of this was that he was running out of money, and so, upon advice from Wentworth, he decided to call Parliament to ask for finances. The short parliament met in April of 1640, and it automatically began with instant opposition and instant disdain towards a number of the policy initiatives that existed during the personal rule on the part of Charles. One of the key leaders in this opposition would be a key leader throughout the entirety of the breakdown of relationships between Charles and Parliament, as well as the essentially the outbreak of the Civil War as well. Ultimately, this was John Pym, and John Pym, along with a number of other members of Parliament, decided to present a petition against Charles, and the petition was criticising a number of aspects of his rule and his personal rule specifically. What is interesting is that Charles, in response to this petition, was actually open to making a certain number of concessions to Parliament, but he was only going to do so on the condition that they would support in granting him more finances. So essentially, he was only willing and open to potentially making concessions to Parliament if he was to get what he wanted from the short parliament, which is obviously more finances. And the result of which was the fact that he would be forced to dissolve Parliament after only 3 weeks. The dissolving of Parliament, the dissolution of Parliament, was in response to the fact that they were opposed to this ultimatum that they had placed upon them by Charles. So all of which leads to a situation where we have no Parliament, we have no finances, and Charles has further problems to deal with. For example, motivated by the need to find more money, Charles would then start to think about calling Parliament again, this time being the Long Parliament. This time, the issues which were had led to Parliament being called, and a Parliament that existed in November 1640 and not being formally dissolved until March of 1660. So we have quite a significant time difference in terms of the length of time that the Long Parliament sat compared to that of the Short Parliament, 3 weeks to 20 years. And so ultimately the build-up of the Long Parliament again revolved around Charles's need for finances. And this again resolved around conflict with the Scots, this time being the Second Bishops' War. The Second Bishops' War was another a disastrous attempt on the part of Charles to try and fight a war with the Scots, and the end result of which left him with the problem of having to pay the Scots for a costly settlement. He was forced to he essentially tried to invade Scotland and instigate the Second Bishops' War with a fighting force who were ill-equipped, unmotivated. Even suggestions were had that they sympathised with the Scots during the conflict. So we have all of these problems taking place. The Second Bishops' War was a disaster for Charles. They were easily fought back, defeated at the Battle of Newburn. It leads to the fact that Charles has to reluctantly sign the Treaty of Ripon. And the Treaty of Ripon, one of the terms of the Treaty of Ripon was that Charles would have to pay £850 per day while the Scots occupied Newcastle. All of these very problematic problems, and the fact that we have now more monetary liabilities that Charles has to deal with, more financial problems. So the Long Parliament is also something that results in the fact that we need more finances on the part of Charles. So again, mounting costs meant that Charles was, upon advice again from a number of advisors, forced to call Parliament again, this time the Long Parliament, which was called in November of 1640. During the Long Parliament, we have a number of MPs, a sort of coalition of MPs, led by John Pym, including people like John Hampden and also Arthur Heselrigg, forming an opposition group against Charles. And this opposition group begins to grow in terms of its prominence and prevalence within Parliament, but it also attracts a certain amount of opposition within Parliament itself. A divide begins to exist between the conservative royalists who supported Charles and those who were more opposed to Charles and his reign. At this point in time, in the sort of 1640, November 1640 period, there weren't many, if any, calls specifically made against Charles, his reign himself. There were critiques of his reign in terms of the things that he did, but not necessarily critiques of his reign himself, as in directly attacking Charles. They believed instead that it was the quote-unquote evil councillors who were the fault of the actions of Charles. And so if it was just the case that Charles could get rid of these councillors and maybe appoint some new ones, this could lead to a situation which would be more politically stable, and they would actually maybe get on with Charles a bit more. All of this goes on with the Long and Short Parliament, and at the same time we have growing resentment beginning to take place among the actual people within London, the society themselves, the Londoners themselves. And these would culminate in two main events, the first of which, or at least one of these events, I should say, being the Root and Branch Petition. Now, the Root and Branch Petition was received by Parliament in December 1640, and it was signed by around 15,000 Londoners. So it was a significantly popular and significantly supported petition among the populace. The petition was one piece of evidence of the degree of disdain that Charles, that was essentially levied towards and against Charles and his advisors' actions. In addition to this, we also see the fact that there was the release of two individuals from prison who were put in prison by Archbishop Laud, these being William Prine and Henry Bertrand. They were released from prison, and when they were released from prison, around 10,000 Londoners came out in celebration of their release. So again, this is something that is representative of Charles's actions, and Londoners celebrating against Charles's actions in the releasing of them from prison. Two pieces of evidence here that show that the general populace were not particularly very happy with Charles, his advisors, and all of their actions. The petition itself, the root and branch petition, listed a number of what were mainly religious grievances on the restrictions of practice, for example, as well as the pushing and promoting of Arminianism. And because it was presented to Parliament, what it did was actually lead to quite a certain direction that Parliament would push in terms of their religious policy in opposition towards Charles. It would form the sort of bedrock of religious opposition within Parliament itself. And it ultimately called for a number of different things to try and resolve the problems. They didn't just list problems; it also tried to provide solutions. Ultimately, calling for the abolition of a number of different bishops. So the root and branch petition is very, very important, but it is also important in the sense that it shows that not only is Parliament in a vacuum opposing some of the actions of Charles, but also individuals within London itself actually opposing the actions of Charles. This would become very important when we think about the outbreak of the Civil War, and we think about the relative strength of both sides of the Civil War itself, with the royalists and the parliamentarians having different advantages, specifically and mainly the parliamentarians having the majority of the advantage. Finally, then, let's think about the attacks on the prerogative, the actual attacks on the monarchical power that Charles held himself, and by extension, the enforcement of an increasing power that was granted to Parliament by these things. So, in order to protect the security of the future of parliaments, Parliament themselves passed the Triennial Act in February 1641. Now, what the Triennial Act ultimately did was ensure that Parliament would have to call, Charles would have to call Parliament at least once every 3 years. So setting a certain fixed amount of times that Parliament has to be called within a certain reign of a monarch. And what is more important, and what is really interesting, is a bypassing of the monarchical authority to call Parliament. Because if this was not achieved, if it was not achieved that every 3 years Parliament was called, the Triennial Act also imposed a provision which allowed Parliament to just meet without the express permission of the monarch himself. This is significant because, of course, before this, all monarchs would be responsible for calling Parliament. We see that monarchs in the past call parliaments at varying amounts of times throughout their particular reign. But if we have a situation where, if under the legislation that is placed here by Parliament, that Charles is unable to, or refuses to call Parliament at least once every 3 years, they're able to meet without the express permission of Charles. This represents a significant attack on the royal prerogative and a significant emboldening of power of Parliament. So all of these things are very, very important. In May 1641, again as an increased result of an increased amount of pressure, what Charles was forced to do was pass the Act Against Forcible Dissolution. Now, what the Act Against Forcible Dissolution did was ensure that the Long Parliament would only ever be allowed to be dissolved if it gives its own permission to do so. What this represents, therefore, is almost the other end of the spectrum from the Triennial Act. So the Triennial Act makes it clear that Parliament has the power to essentially call itself if Charles refuses to do so. But what the Act Against Forcible Dissolution does is give Parliament the power to decide when it dissolves itself. So Charles no longer has the ability to just unilaterally dissolve Parliament whenever he chooses to. Instead, Parliament is dissolved when it gives its own permission to do so. Again, a further attack on the monarchical power of the royal prerogative and a further emboldening of power of Parliament. So, essentially what these both did was give Parliament more power than they ever had and represented a significant erosion of the royal prerogative in relation to its relationship with Parliament and the calling of Parliament. In terms of the practical things that were done in terms of the relationship between Parliament and the advisors of Charles, there were a number of impeachments that were issued against Charles's advisors. Again, remember, Parliament and the people within Parliament were focusing their attention at this point not necessarily on Charles, but more on Charles's advisors, the quote-unquote evil advisors. And there were a number of them who had been impeached. For example, the majority of the judges who sat in the prerogative courts in the 1630s had been impeached by this point by 1640. Archbishop Laud, who, as we remember, imposed a lot of very radical religious reforms, was arrested in November of 1640 and was held in the Tower of London, and was only released from the Tower of London when he was executed in 1645. So not necessarily a release per se. Thomas Wentworth was also arrested and charged with high treason. We'll get on to the trial and execution of Wentworth in a future lesson, because this really does devolve into and how it represents how the Civil War begins. Ultimately, he is executed on the 12th of May of 1641. He is actually executed, a little fun fact, under the auspices and under by permission of Archbishop Laud. So Archbishop Laud will actually allow essentially the execution of Thomas Wentworth, and then not very long after become arrested and executed himself. A number of key advisors managed to flee the attacks on themselves, essentially. So, for example, individuals like John Finch and Francis Winebank were able to flee in December 1640 before the issuance of their impeachments actually managed to take place. So, for example, Finch fled to Holland before his impeachment, and Winebank also fled to the continent. So we see really a number of things take place in a relatively short amount of time. Despite the fact that the Long Parliament doesn't officially dissolve until 1660, the period from sort of the beginning of 1640 to the end of 1640, to December 1640, is representative of a very significant number of events. We see the short parliament take place in April of that time. We see the calling of the long parliament in the November period of that time, and we see the attacks. And the erosion on the royal prerogative, as well as the attacks on the advisors of Charles in this period as well. The next lesson we're going to pick up from essentially where we've left off here, talk about the high treason charge that was presented to Thomas Wentworth, talk about the trial and the execution of Thomas Wentworth, and talk about the events that lead up to the outbreak of the Civil War, when Charles flees London and calls and raises his own army against Parliament.